Mexicans are preparing to vote in the largest elections in the country's history. The Latin American nation is grappling with rising violence. Dozens of candidates have been killed during the campaign period. What's behind the political violence in Mexico? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Almost 100 million Mexicans are eligible to vote in general elections on June the 2nd. It's historic, not only for being the largest vote in the country's history, but because it's almost certain the next president will be a woman. Current President Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador is unapologetically a populist. He's also expanded the military and the role it plays in society, part of a pledge to crack down on corruption and organized crime. So have his policies improved the lives of Mexicans? What problems will his successor inherit? We'll be asking those questions and more to our guests in a moment. First, though, this report by Michael Apple.
Presidenta. Claudia Sheinbaum, a former mayor of Mexico City, is the front-runner in a historic election. For the first time, two women are going head-to-head for the presidency. She's been endorsed by outgoing President Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador.
Claudia is not corrupt. She is honest and very intelligent. She has a doctorate, and most importantly, she has good feelings. She loves the people.
Sheinbaum is running under the banner of the leftist National Regeneration Movement called Morena. She's promised Mexico's nearly 100 million voters she'll continue Lopez Obrador's popular pro-poor policies.
It is clear to me that my obligation is to lead Mexico along the path of peace, security, democracy, and justice.
Her rival, Xochitl Galvez, is the face of a broad opposition coalition that's been outspoken about the oversized role of the military and the rise in organized crime. The run-up to the election has been marred by political assassinations, with the killing of more than 30 candidates in the past year. It's those standing for local office who are most often targeted. But Sheinbaum's supporters are adamant that while she could be seen as merely offering more of the same policies, that's exactly what they want.
She's a highly prepared woman with the responsibility to continue with this project of transformation at the national level. For more than 70 years, we have lived in injustice, especially the most disadvantaged, who make up more than 70% of the population in Mexico.
Questions persist whether Sheinbaum will step out of her predecessor's shadow once he leaves office, or whether the undeniably popular Lopez Obrador will still have a hand in Mexico's future for years to come. Michael Apple, Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Mexico City, Carlos Bravo Regidor Political Analyst, Associate Professor of Journalism. You specialize in history and contemporary politics in Mexico and the United States. Thanks for being with us. In Washington, D.C., Maureen Meyer is the Vice President in charge of programs at the Washington Office on Latin America. That's an NGO that promotes rights, democracy, and social and economic justice in Latin America. Also in Mexico City, Falko Ernst, Senior Analyst on Mexico at the International Crisis Group. You have lived in communities in Mexico controlled by organized crime. You'll be telling us about that in just a moment. Welcome to everybody. I want to start with Carlos. So you're in Mexico City. Carlos, bring us into the conversation that Mexicans are having, whether it's over coffee, over dinner, amongst friends. How are Mexicans talking? What are they saying about this election cycle?
Well, this is actually a very interesting question. What we've seen on the one hand is, that Mexicans do recognize the mixed bag of results that, that this government has produced. Poll after poll, for instance, you see that crime and insecurity is the most, sensitive and concerning subject, and that people do not approve the performance of this government between 70 and 80%. But on the other hand, social programs, cash transfers, are the star of the show, and people approve them, along the same lines of 70, 80%. In other subjects, things go 50-50. So it's really a mixed judgment regarding government performance. But on the other hand, presidential approval is around the low 60s, and it has been very stable since the pandemic. So there is a certain dissonance between government performance evaluation and presidential approval, and this dissonance is translating into the electoral process because voting intention for the presidential coalition for Morena is higher. It's around 50%, and the question is why. And
so Carlos, pause for a second. We're going to definitely get into the why, because you say there's mixed reviews from Mexicans, right, on this president. 70 to 80% disapproval of his handling of crime, yes. And it's also the number one issue for Mexicans. That does sort of stand in contrast with the fact that the president is popular and that the polls say his chosen successor is very likely to win the next election.
That's exactly right, and yes, it's a bit troubling when you look at it, when you talk to people. But it starts making sense when you see that Lopez Obrador's popularity is not necessarily based on his results, but actually on what he has come to represent to many people, on a certain identification he has built, particularly with with majorities that are poor or that are low middle class. And particularly with the fact that the traditional political class in Mexico, the traditional political parties, are very discredited. There is an appetite for continuity, very dependent upon the fact that oppositions carry a lot of weight, a lot of anger from the past. People voted for change for Lopez Obrador in 2018. And right now, the opposition candidate cannot run with a platform of change with the parties that just six years ago people were voting against because they represented change.
Okay, so you're saying that
a key factor.
The base of this outgoing president and probably his successor, right, Claudia Sheinbaum, is so fed up with the right wing that has run Mexico for 70 years prior to this presidential term. They're so fed up with that they are actually willing to forgive him for what they do acknowledge is at best, mixed record on crime. Did I get this right?
Yes, although I think the record does not play such a significant role. And what plays a larger significant role is the identification with the leadership of Lopez Obrador and what he has come to represent as an important and swift change regarding previous governments. Okay,
so personality politics plays a big role. Mexico's certainly not the only country where that's the case. And Lopez Obrador is a strong personality and political figure as a result of that, leftist populist. We want to talk about crime really at the heart of this election, because you did say this is the most significant issue for voters. And from the outside looking in, the numbers in terms of criminality are just jaw-dropping. We just said 125 people killed in 2024 in politically motivated killing. I mean, that's really, this data comes from Data Civica. It's really quite extraordinary. Falko, can I turn to you on that? What is the conversation around crime as relates to this election?
Right. So as we just heard, I think, you've had a separation of policy and discourse on the presidential level and overall in the public debate, in the sense that you have had a worsening of conflict realities. You've had a phenomenon in which criminal groups have been effectively given the leeway over this government and also the past one to further dig into local economies, to dig into institutional control, into populational control.
What do you mean? Explain that. What do you mean they got the leeway to expand their institutional control?
Right. So essentially, we've had an inertia in terms of policy formulation as to how to unwind criminal networks, how to systematically dismantle criminal networks. And there has been a recognition by many political leaders that insecurity is a risky topic to be proactive about, to actually do something, because it had backfired a number of times in the past, and political figures had been getting burned by sticking their necks out and saying they will fix security and actually trying to do that on the ground. So instead, it's become boiled down to a PR issue, and we've seen it very clearly during this administration that, we've heard every day during a press brief first by the president and his people that things are going really well in terms of security. The direct quote is that there's peace and tranquility in the country. And on the ground, according to our research that we've conducted in a number of high conflict areas, criminal groups have effectively been given an offer to dial down on the most spectacular type of violence that can become an electoral and a political problem in exchange for greater leeway in how they govern their territory. So there has been an offer of impunity, and these groups, the leaders that we talked to, told us very clearly that they have seen an opening for themselves to build up greater assets, including by pushing into illicit economies, imposing protection rackets on agriculture, on industry, on local shops, and so on and so forth.
You're saying that the International Crisis Group, according to your research, what you're seeing is that the government has essentially tried to sort of cut a deal a little bit under the radar with criminal groups, saying, hey, we want less of the high-profile murders, and in exchange, maybe, what is that deal? What are you saying the deal is?
Yeah, essentially, there has been this offer for them to lay low a little bit more, to not murder as publicly, to not be as frank and overt about their claim of power, in exchange for less operations, including military operations, being channeled their way. That has been the intellectual aspiration of this government, because they entered their administration with huge security problems at their hands. And they've been trying to find pragmatic ways for pacifying the country. Now, this aspiration hasn't necessarily worked out because it reckoned that the state still has this informal arbitrating power, but at the same time, the number of groups to begin with, criminal groups that we have active in Mexico, had already exploded to a number of at least 200. So it's a bit of a hornet's nest, and criminal conflict and criminal predation as well has become something largely self-perpetual that the government has found very, very hard to control.
And just before I turn to you, Maureen, last one for you, Falko. What about the homicide rate, the murder rate? Because that's usually how you measure success and failure of a security policy, right? My understanding is the numbers I have are 180,000 homicides during the presidency of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, which is higher than his predecessors, if you're judging for the whole term, and roughly about 30,000, it's just dipped under the 30,000 mark, 30,000 homicides a year, which is still very high by historical standards. So if you look at the numbers, it does not seem that his policy has resulted in lower crime.
Yeah, the realities on the ground can absolutely be questioned. We have a record homicide number total over the whole administration, as you already mentioned. But at the same time, officially, the homicide rate has begun to drop under this administration by a few points. And that has been used to then state publicly that things are going better now that we're moving in the right direction. Right.
Okay, Maureen, it's time we introduce our viewers to the hugs not bullets policy, which this president, the outgoing president, is very well known for. He came into office saying we have to address the root cause of these criminal gangs, and the root cause, according to him, was poverty. So he said that is why we need social welfare programs. Can you give us a brief history of the hugs not bullets policy?
The policy itself, I think, came out of a debate slogan of, why he was going to shift policies away from what from his predecessors were much more use of force, military confrontation with criminal groups. So I think there's two important things here. One, Lopez Obrador did dedicate more resources to both subsidies for poor populations, as Carlos alluded
social
to,
programs,
in terms of pensions for elderly, scholarships, apprenticeships for young people, issues aimed at, particularly for young people, trying to incentivize them to not be working with criminal organizations, to not feel that need to be recruited by a group. On the flip side, though, the not bullets part has not been the case. And what we've seen is actually an extreme expansion of the role of Mexico's military in security throughout the country, the creation of a new force, the National Guard, which was meant to be civilian, but is in every way military, run by the military, and mostly composed of soldiers. So we've seen still very much a strategy based on deploying security forces. And really what's been lacking in this whole strategy is addressing the impunity that Falko alluded to, the fact that you have currently 9 out of 10 crimes that go uninvestigated or underreported in the country. And so if you have a system that is incapable of holding criminal groups accountable for their actions, that is not investigating the collusion that you have between government officials and criminal groups, then those crimes continue to perpetuate because there's really no consequence to the actions, just like there's very little consequences to the number of candidates that have been killed or threatened. If there's no investigation into those responsible, they're just going to continue to happen.
So the hugs not bullets policy kind of became, if I listen to what you just said, a hugs and bullets. It turned into a hugs and bullets policy and impunity, which of course wasn't supposed to be the case. Carlos, is that something is that high on Mexican voters' radar? Is that something that they care about?
They do care a lot about insecurity, about crime, about extortion. But unfortunately, at the same time, this subject has become so normalized. It has, been incorporated into the cost structure of, small, middle, and big business, into the everyday, life of people, that at the same time, even though they care for it, a lot of people are not transferring the cost of this to the party currently government. There is a surprising, small amount of punishment vote, so to speak, because other issues are in their mind, and particularly other grievances. And it's troubling also because, apart from security, there's also the fact that Mexico has undergone a process of democratic backsliding. That, poll after poll, what you see is that people do not care, agree, or do not understand it. So at the beginning, the opposition tried to campaign, in defense of democracy, but very early on, they realized this was a framing that was really not flying among the electorate, and then they switched to other things, particularly to security. But that is also an issue that is very relevant, not only for this election, but for the next government. Both Lopez Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum have brought it deliberately, explicitly to the ballot, the so-called Plan C, which implies reforming both electoral institutions at the Supreme Court, which has been the most important check on this government, are at stake. In this election. This does not mean that democracy will end in Mexico. It is certainly under threat. It has resisted, but if we say it has resisted, it's precisely because it has been, under attack. And these attacks could get, a lot stronger if Morena has a strong showing, and they could argue that, these issues were on the ballot and people supported them.
Yeah, to carry out constitutional changes, they would need a supermajority in Congress, which I believe the polls are saying they probably will not get. Again, it's just polls at this stage, but probably they won't get it. Maureen, Carlos was talking to us about democracy, which is really the big picture that I wanted to focus on with you. You work on democracy and social justice. What is the impact on democracy when you have such high levels of criminality, when they are, as Falko was telling us, embedded so deeply into the fabric of local politics especially? What does that do to a country?
And I think on the immediate is citizens not being able to vote for their candidate of choice. Sometimes they're voting for the candidate that was imposed on them by organized criminal groups, which I think we're seeing at the municipal level, and including candidates, obviously, that have been killed, that may have been someone, wanting to vote for that candidate. So there's a lot of who people are actually voting for that matters. On election day, because of violence, you may see people in parts of the country that don't go to vote because they're too afraid to go out to the polls or to serve in the electoral polling stations themselves. I think in the immediate, there's that, but there's the longer term impact of what does it mean when your local mayor or congressperson doesn't represent your interests or the interests of the local community as much as organized criminal groups. And that then deviates resources to, allowing criminal activity to expand, to determining, where public works money is getting invested in, corruption issues there. So there's a lot of concern, I think, of the longer term impact of what does it mean when criminal organizations control, for the most part, certain local governments, and what does that mean for the citizens who then have very little recourse to feel safe and to decide who can you denounce a crime to if the people you're confronting are part of the problem.
Right. And if they're not representing the voice of the voters, that completely subverts the whole principle of democracy and electoral representation. Falko, we said at the top of the show that you actually lived, and you have to explain this to us, you embedded yourself as part of your research earlier in your career in a community or multiple communities, I don't know, you'll tell us, that were run by organized crime. I don't know if any of those periods in time covered an electoral campaign, but can you tell us what that was like, what you saw boots on the ground level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was doing research for my PhD at the time about 13 years ago, and ended up living in Michoacan, sort of like the cradle of local organized crime. Michoacan is a high crime state. It remains one of the more violent ones, and just through luck or bad luck, I don't know yet, I ended up staying very extended periods of time in those communities. And actually, in months when I was on the ground the first time, we had the 2012 elections. And,
so what was that like?
That was very telling in terms of state crime overlaps, as Maureen just described, because essentially I was having a number of conversations with political operators, with local civilians, local officials, but also criminal leaders, a group called the Knights Templar at the time, and other members of this group. And they were all telling me that for them, essentially the most crucial resource for them to have to stay afloat, to further the interest, was gaining access to the state, including through investments into the electoral process and by striking deals with different levels of candidates and political parties. So we talked through sort of like their methodology, and we've continued these conversations over time and sort of noticed how that game has changed.
So how do they do it? You say striking deals with elected officials or candidates and political parties. How do they do it? Is it do they bribe them? Do they threaten them? How does it work?
There's a mixture of techniques you can apply, essentially. So the most basic is pumping money into campaigns, is sending your own candidates, which is something we're seeing more frequently these days, into the race. So you don't just co-opt, you actually take the institution and you control directly the candidates. And what is very, very important for them as well is to have social control over local populations, because essentially if you control those populations, you can tell them who to vote for. And that brings bargaining chips. You have trades of blocks of vote to trade in these negotiations. And the other key insight here, I think, is that we often see and produce sort of like an image that it is the bad guys, the stereotypical bad guys, the cartels, quote unquote, pushing into the state, taking the state. But you have a great openness by state functionaries, by state officials, and by candidates and political parties as well, to play along and to try and seek to further the interest as well through these shady deals. So it really flows from both sides.
I wonder, just before I take it back to Carlos, do you have a number of how much of the country is compromised in that way? I ask because I read a number, an estimate as high as 20%, but it may no longer be accurate.
I mean, it really depends on how you define control in this context, right? Because you have a very high variety of different negotiations between state and crime. Sometimes you have criminal groups controlling the show at the municipal level in certain states. In other areas, as you move up the ladder in terms of state power to the governor's level, to the federal level, you have a greater degree of power in those negotiations and more leeway by these higher levels of state. And so the relationship changes. What we see a lot is sort of joint ventures between both sides, but it really depends on each side where, to what degree criminal groups actually control the thing. And just generally speaking, I think what we've also seen is a lack of control by particular actors. As I mentioned before, we have about 200 groups active, and they all want to push into the state. So these relationships between those sides have become really unstable, and that brings a lot of violence in the political process.
Carlos, you mentioned that a lot of this violence has become so normal, so normalized to Mexicans and Mexican voters. I wonder, is there a genuine hope among Mexican voters that this can change? Because it's true, the country has become almost synonymous, right, with drug-related violence that just seeps into every facet of the country's governance.
I'm glad you asked this question, because in previous administrations where violence was growing, was still at very high levels, there was at least a certain post-militarization horizon. The militarization of public security happened in many instances because police forces were unable or unwilling, incapable of really putting up a fight against organized crime, because of their firepower, because of their numbers in terms of personnel, for a variety of reasons. But militarization was always, well, the last instance, but we need to do this. But always, both under Felipe Calderón and under Enrique Peña Nieto, previous presidents, there was always this idea that, okay, we're doing this as an exceptional measure, but we're trying to train new police forces. We're investing a lot of money, to have at some point a civil force ready to take over. And that, that post-militarization horizon was abandoned under Lopez Obrador. Police forces have really been, put aside. In a lot of states, we have military that are the secretaries of security at the state level, also at the municipal level. And this somehow implies that we have given up on the fact that, this was an extraordinary and exceptional measure, and it has become the new normal. And this is from the policy side of the equation. From the population side, oddly enough, the military still polls very high. Somehow people, say, well, this is the only resource we have. The military have a good reputation in Mexico because they, participated in a lot of efforts when there were natural disasters. And they are a vehicle of social mobility. So in spite of human rights violations, in spite of corruption, in spite, a lot of what Falko was saying about complicity between authorities and the military, this has also helped the government to militarize even more with very little political cost. So I think this tells you, from both sides, from the policy side and the population side, this has become the new normal, even though the results are far from good. This has the physiognomy of a tragedy. On the one hand, it seems that this is the only alternative we have, we still have remaining. And at the very same time, we know this alternative will not provide results that we can say are improving things.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Carlos, thank you very much. I want to thank all our guests, Carlos Bravo Regidor, Maureen, Meyer, and Falko Ernst for joining us. Thank you all for your time. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. The handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril, Vanier, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.